to Angela Stent. Angela Stent is the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies, as well as a professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown. She's also, like me, a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and has written more books on the state of U.S. Russia European relations than I could care to count. She's a trustee of the Eurasia Foundation and of the Sports for Civil Society of Russia. She received her BA from Cambridge, 2 master's degrees, one from LSE and one from Harvard, and her PhD from Harvard. And she's going to be speaking, or rather, my co-director of the program, Christopher Miller, is going to be speaking with her about her award-winning book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. And the most important thing I can say in this entire introduction is that the book is available for purchase over there. And I am sure Professor Stent would be happy to autograph any copy that you would procure during this process. But for now, I will just take it away. But first, I actually have to give Professor Stent the plaque, so you can come up here. Congratulations on winning the award.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to get it. I'll sit here.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. Okay, excellent. Well, I thought we could start, Angela, by putting the story you sketch out about Putin's world in the broader context in which you place Putin. On the one hand, we have this fixation about Vladimir Putin, the man, shirtless, trekking through Siberia. But as you show, there's a long history that shaped Russian foreign policy, which you trace all the way back to Catherine the Great and even further. So can you give us a sense of what is this historical context and what does it mean for Russian foreign policy?
I'm delighted to. I just want to say I'm delighted to be here this evening and to have the prize. So I do go back and I look at the sort of longer term factors that have influenced Russians' view of the world and their place in the world. And one of them, and you see this very much with what Putin says today, but this is, again, in a centuries-long tradition, it's the idea of Russian exceptionalism, that Russia is a unique civilization, and that many people, I quote the famous poet Fyodor Tchurchev saying, there can be no alliance between Russia and the West, we will always be antagonists, and he said, some centuries ago, that what Russia should do is to foster disunity in the West. So the idea that Russia is a unique civilization, it's superior to that of the West, and it can never have, harmonious relations with the West. That's one part of it, and really superior to the West. And then the other thing is Russians and Russian leaders and people's sense of their place on the Eurasian landmass, the spatial aspects of this kind of traditional, if you like, mindset, and the fact that Russia really never had clear borders. And I quote Catherine the Great, the German princess who became a Russian Tsarina, saying, that which stops growing begins to rot. I have to expand my borders in order to defend my country. So the idea of kind of defensive expansionism and Russia being the victim of invaders from the east, the south, the west, that I think has a long tradition. And you see it at play today in the Russian-Ukrainian war. The idea that Russia needs buffers and that today's Russia under Vladimir Putin defines its security perimeter not as the borders of the Russian Federation, but of those of the post-Soviet space. So all of those things, again, this kind of sense of vulnerability and expansion, and Russia, having a right also to be a great power, which is part of this tradition, and the exceptionalism, and all these things, I think, inform the kinds of things that we see happening today and what we see the Russian leadership saying.
And I think that the sense of vulnerability coupled with expansionism is, on the one hand, so hard for many Americans to understand, and you're right, so crucial. I guess it's
Let me just say,
sure.
I've heard Vladimir Putin say, you Americans, you only have 2 neighbors and you get on with them pretty well. Maybe today we don't get on with one of them that well, or both of them. But anyway, and then he will always say how many neighbors Russia has and how porous its borders are. Yeah.
But of course, when you look back to the 1990s and even the early 2000s, things at least looked rather different at the time. Relations between Russia and its neighbors were by many metrics, I think, much more promising. And so a lot of scholars see a transition point in the 2000s. What's changed from the 1990s, so optimistic, to the present day?
So I think one of the questions I try and answer in my book is why we in the West were wrong or got it wrong when we expected Russia after the Soviet collapse to want to become more like the West, to have similar institutions to Western institutions, to want to be better integrated. And I think even if you go back to the 1990s, the more we find out about it, yes, Boris Yeltsin and his few advisors really did genuinely want better relations with the West, because as his first foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, said, the West is a country, you know, this is a collection of rich countries, they're prosperous countries, and we want to be like them. But you see, even in the early 90s, people questioning you know, why Russia should want to become more like the West, and harking back to Russia's unique role and already inventing a myth that somehow the West was responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union. So when Putin came in, and he promised, A, that he wanted to restore a strong state. And you have to remember, obviously, at this time, Russia had gone through a terrible economic crisis in 1998. People had lost their savings. People felt that there was chaos. Older people had lost their pensions. So to have someone young come in, young and sober come in, and say, I'm going to restore a strong state, that was important. But then I think right from the beginning he also believed, and if you read his millennial statement that was put out in the year 2000 when he first came into office, he said Russia has always been a great power and will be a great power. So I think there was that desire to restore Russia as a great power. And having said all of that, he was just very lucky because oil prices rose between, you know, the year 2000, you've written about that in your own book, and 2008, and enabled him, with rising oil prices and greater prosperity and rising living standards, enabled him to do things domestically that Yeltsin wasn't able to do.
And the title of your book is obviously Putin-centric, Putin's World, but in some ways the story you sketch is actually about the Russian elite more generally.
Yeah.
To what extent is this Russian elite going to remain persistent into the future? Or should we expect changes in how the Russian elite thinks as new generations come to power, for example?
So I was just talking, you know, with you and some of your colleagues about, I found it already a little disconcerting 10 years ago when I taught a course at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and I know, Fletcher, you now have a relationship with them, you go there all the time. I found it disconcerting even then that most of the young people I was teaching, or really all of them at least, in the class, did not believe that the Soviet Union collapsed because of its own weaknesses. They all believed that the Soviet Union collapsed because of the United States and its special services were out to collapse the Soviet Union. And so, if you do have that mindset and you still have the idea that Russia was robbed of what was rightfully, you know, it should have been, and a lot of people now in Russia will not admit that, you know, the collapse was inevitable. They think it just happened because of circumstances and low oil prices. So that's my way of saying you would have to sort of change that mentality. So you can still have, of course, a younger, and you already have that today, elite young people, you meet them too, who travel to the West, who do business with the West. That doesn't mean that their idea of what Russia's role in the world should be, or even their ideas about the West, are what we assume they might be given their level of education. And, you know, if you talk to people about, you know, a lot of young Russians are educated, for instance, they go to high school or maybe university in England. But, you know, they do not come away from that experience imbibing British values. So I think you just have to assume that the next generations will still have what are Russian values. But of course, they may not believe in pursuing policies that are quite as antagonistic toward the West, or they may have a different idea of what it means for Russia to act as a great power.
Well, I guess that points us to the question of how does the West interact with Russia, and as you've written in your previous books and in this book as well, both the policies of containment and engagement have produced similar results, which is that Russia and the West don't get along. Right. So what should be done?
Well, and that, of course, was the third question I ask in my book, and the hardest to answer. I mean, I think you have to accept, right, the Russia that is and not the one that you want it to be. And I think probably by now people understand that. So you have to deal with Russia without thinking that we can have an impact on what happens inside Russia, because I think it's been proven that we've really had very little impact. It's been marginal. And then I think you have to decide what are the issues which are most important to us, where we do share some common interest with the Russians. And you can identify them. I mean, it's, you know, it's clear. It's things like arms control, even though you could say right now our own administration doesn't believe that, but in general, that should be one of the areas. That we have worked with the Russians to some extent on issues that have to do with counterterrorism successfully. Sometimes it doesn't work, but occasionally it does, so you should pursue those. You know, eventually we probably do have to have conversations with the Russians about the whole cybersphere and are there rules of the road that you can in fact agree on. Not that it's not challenging, but in the end you really do have to do that. We are working with the Russians in areas like the Arctic, in space, you know, unless this huge space program that the Trump administration's announced really succeeds, we're still going to depend on the Russians for our own space program. So there are areas, there are compartments certainly that you could work with the Russians on, where you have, you know, similar interests narrowly defined. But the idea of so many previous resets that you can somehow unlock something that would create a qualitatively different cooperative relationship, I think that's highly unlikely.
When I guess the story of the past decade is the opposite, that relations gotten less and less cooperative, and it's not only in the former Soviet Union anymore, it's now in places like the Middle East, which you look at, Latin America even. How do you interpret Russia's expansion, or might say return to regions where it was quite active during the Soviet period?
Well, I think Putin has been very clever, and I do go into a little bit in my book the fact that Putin excelled at judo. That's what got him out of a rather hardscrabble childhood, and I have a picture in the book of him from the Leningrad Evening newspaper in 1976 saying, this 24-year-old young man has just won the judo championship, you know, watch out for him, he's going places. And so, even though myself, I don't do judo, you know, obviously one of the skills you learn in judo is you can be physically weaker than your opponent, but if you understand their own weaknesses and their own distractions, you can still prevail. So one of the things I think Putin has been very adept at doing, and don't forget he's been in office now for 19 years, is taking advantage of Western distraction, Western weakness, the lack of, you know, a clear US policy, and just going in there. Syria is an obvious example. There was a red line, and then there wasn't a red line, and then you see Russia going in 2015 in September and beginning a bombing campaign, shoring up Assad when it looked as if he was going to lose. And now has established itself, and I go into that in the book, really as the only major power in the Middle East that talks to all sides. So it has, you know, pretty good relations with Iran, with Shia groups, with all of the Sunni states, and with Israel. In fact, its two newest partners have been Saudi Arabia and Israel, both US allies, who for different reasons seek a partnership with Russia, partly because they both think Russia can temper Iranian ambitions in the region, which maybe it can, but they believe it can. So there, Putin has taken advantage, and unlike in the Soviet era, when the Soviet Union in the Middle East and other places chose sides ideologically, Russia has not chosen sides. The US has chosen sides in the Middle East. Obviously now Iran is depicted as the greatest threat. But for the Russians, you know, they'll talk to anyone. And if you go to the Middle East, many countries believe that Russia is a sort of neutral arbiter. So that's, I think, enabled Russia to go there. Now, you could look at Venezuela. And I think that is, you begin to think that's already qualitatively something different. I mean, the Russians have been involved in Venezuela since Hugo Chavez came to power, but they're now digging in. And I think, again, that's partly because, you know, they just want to show the United States that they can be in the United States, its neighborhood, and be an irritant to it. But Russia is going back to Africa, and they've had articles like that recently. They don't spend that much money on doing it. It's still fairly low cost, but they're able to project power, selling arms to these countries, you know, building nuclear power plants, training their security services. And so they're, again, making use of their limited resources in a fairly sophisticated way.
And the other region of the world, I think, which has stood out in the past 5 years is, of course, Asia. On the one hand, the rapprochement with Japan has not been as successful from the Japanese perspective as Tokyo might like, but from Russia's perspective, they managed to improve ties with both Japan and, most importantly, China at the same time.
Yeah.
Where do you expect the Russia-China relationship to go in the future?
So, I know you're writing about this now, you know, the Russia-China relationship is controversial in this country and in the West in general, because some people still think this is an axis of convenience, that it's not really going anywhere, there are too many asymmetries. And then there are other people who think increasingly that this is a very dangerous partnership for the United States. I think it is a strong partnership, and it's growing stronger, despite the asymmetries. China is a rising power, Russia obviously isn't. But China has really stepped in since 2014 when the West tried to isolate Russia, and that's with, with the rest. And making a big, signing a big natural gas deal with Russia, investing more, although not as much as the Russians want, in the Russian Far East, and backing up Russia, supporting Russia where the West has criticized it and sanctioned it. Both countries say that they favor a post-West order. We can talk about what they didn't think that really means. But they both feel that the current and previous post-Cold War order dominated by the United States has neglected their interests. They've had no agency in it, and they believe it's time for them to have more agency. And so I'm sure when you go to MGIMO, they talk ad nauseum about the new multipolar world with the US in decline. One wants to say not so fast, but the Chinese talk about the new multipolar world. And then they back each other up on all the major foreign policy issues, and of course they support each other in terms of what they do domestically. They would never criticize each other for repressing journalists, throwing people in jail. Where I have questions is sort of going forward. Russia is the junior partner in this relationship now, and apparently doesn't matter at the moment to the Russians, but in the future, how will they see that? And then you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, to the extent that that's happening and will happen. There's not very much in that for Russia, despite all the flowery language, and it means that China becomes more and more prominent in their common neighborhood, Central Asia. And so I think ultimately that may be more disadvantageous for Russia than it wants to admit. But the irony is that, the potential of China being a threat to Russia is something that is never uttered formally. I mean, people will talk about it informally, whereas obviously the West is seen as the great danger, is depicted as the great danger.
Well, I'll turn over to the audience for questions. Maybe one final question from me is, when you put all this together, it strikes me that there are two different stories that one hears. One is that, as you said, China is rising, Russia's not rising. But when you look at where Russia's involved in terms of foreign policy, it's more active than at any point since the Gorbachev period, if not beforehand. So how do we interpret Russian foreign policy? Is it working? Is it not working? Should we be afraid or not afraid?
I mean, some of it's working. So Russia is very good at disrupting. I mean, that's the other thing. Going in, disrupting sort of Western interests, taking advantage of polarization, for instance, in Western societies, be it in Europe or the United States. We know all of that. On the other hand, you can look at Ukraine. So on the one hand, you can say, well, what they did in Ukraine was successful in as much as they acted as a disruptor. It also helped Putin domestically, at least for a few years. That effect has worn off now, but for a few years, it shored up his popularity when the economy was very bad. But you could also say that Russian actions in Ukraine have now helped solidify Ukrainian national identity, which really was much more split before. So is that really successful? I mean, it depends which question you're looking at. You could also say Russia has no allies. Now, I don't think the Russians want allies, or they say they don't because allies restrict your freedom of maneuver. But it means that Russia sort of operates very much in its own orbit. And there are advantages to that, but also disadvantages to it. And you can also say, obviously, with its actions, it's alienated, large populations in the West, and it's led to the imposition of all of these sanctions, which, now that they're congressionally mandated, may never be lifted or not lifted for a very long time. So it's clearly a mixed bag. But what's striking is Russia's ability then to project influence and to some extent power globally.
Well, I'll turn over to the audience now for questions on any of the themes we've discussed or anything else that you're interested in U.S.-Russian relations. Sir?
How do you explain Putin's enduring high popularity, even with the sanctions and with the deteriorating economy? I heard that his popularity recently declined from like 80% to 60%, but it's just, if those numbers are real, which I don't know if they are, but if they are, it's incredible.
Well, so first of all, yes, his popularity has declined by at least 20 points if you believe the numbers. And I do believe the numbers of the Levada polling organization because it's the best one, even though they themselves admit it's sometimes hard to know whether people are really telling the truth. Putin is popular largely in the countryside. He's not popular in the major cities, right? In the last elections, even though the numbers were probably falsified, I mean, a majority of Muscovites didn't vote for him. And I think the same is true in St. Petersburg and some of the other cities. So the urban elites don't like him, but he appeals to the, plays on these populist themes, right? He appeals to the people out in the provinces whose lives are really not that good, but whose standard of living has risen under him. Now that's beginning to change. And he projects the image of a strong leader. Russia is again feared, and blames the West for all of the Russians' economic woes. You see some cracks in that, though. It used to be that the Russian population would blame, middle-level bureaucrats for corruption and for the problems that they have in life. Now, a majority of Russians, again, if you read the Levada polling numbers, say that they would rather have change than stability. They don't want stability anymore. And particularly the pension reforms that were introduced last year, raising the pension age and sort of, monetizing pensions and things like that in a way that wasn't done before, those have been very unpopular. So just anecdotally, the person who drives me when I go to Russia, takes me around and everything I've known for a long time, who has always been supportive of Putin, I got an earful from him about the pension reforms. This is someone who is probably around 50, but is thinking about what it's going to mean and how long he's going to work. And then it was the first time that I'd ever heard things like, all those people at the top, they have all the money, and we poor working stiffs have to keep working, and now they're making us work longer. So I don't want to say that revolution is imminent, because it isn't. But you can see somewhat more questioning among the people. But he does remain popular in parts of the countryside.
Excuse me, I'd like to go back to the China-Russia relationship. I was in China about a year ago and saw these big infrastructure projects. I don't think I really understood them. And more recently, I've begun to understand from the Chinese point of view that this construction of new supply routes is a much deeper process of trying to establish economic leadership.
Yeah.
And so the Russian integration and acceptance of Belt and Road is a way of them, in a sense, as junior partners. And they can't ever be anything other than junior partners with China driving the train, so to speak. But it's an odd thing, and yet it seems like they don't have any alternative. And I don't know that they have any alternative as the world economy is evolving, and their energy exports are evolving more to the east. And isn't this kind of an inevitable alliance rather than an alliance of convenience? I mean,
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in that. Yeah, I mean the Belt and Road. I mean, every time we realize its dimensions are huge, and then it's already taking up things that already exist, right?
Yeah.
And then you have countries like Italy signing on, which is, and maybe some other European countries. So yes, the Russians can't fight that. There is the Eurasian Economic Union, and it does have an agreement with the Belt and Road project, but as far as I can see, nothing has actually happened. In theory, they're joint projects. I don't know. Have you found any actual projects that are part of that? No, not in Russia. So again, the Russians aren't going to get very much out of it. But yes, of course, they cannot fight it, so they're trying to join it and get something out of it. I'm not sure how much they will get out of it either.
But they do have the transport routes that they're developing along the polar route. That's part of Belt and Road.
That is part of the Belt.
And one of my friends there is telling me about new fiber optic links for transport of information across Eurasia, that will cross Russia, that Russia's having a big part in. So these are pretty fundamental linkages that are taking place.
Yeah, and then they will be more integrated, obviously, with the Chinese project.
Yeah.
Okay.
Angela, I have a question about the BRICS. You can argue that, Russia was the progenitor of that.
Right.
And in some ways, was the first sort of non-Western financial institution, you can argue, was the BRICS New Development Bank. But since that time, China has then gone on with the AIB as well as BRI. And there would be a perception that, you know, whereas Russia started this, the BRICS as a grouping seem less and less relevant compared to the China-led organizations. Do you see any way in which Russia might try to revitalize the BRICS, or is that a organization that will continue to persist, obviously, because they, you know, these things rarely die, but not have the same utility that Russia anticipated?
Yeah, I think it would be very hard for them to revive it. I mean, I think you're right. It's going to continue. They still meet. They have they have the bank. They have different projects. But it's clearly been overshadowed now by these Chinese-led financial institutions. So I would think probably from the Chinese point of view, they might as well go along with still having the BRICS. I mean, it doesn't seem to be harmful to anything else they're doing. But I see the BRICS as something, I mean, it was important when the Russians first started as a way of saying, this is an alternative organization, there's no, you know, the United States and Europe aren't in this, you know, we're new, we're different. But, you know, as you know, the original concept of the BRICS, Jim O'Neill thought that Russia was one of these rising powers, and economically, it hasn't turned out like that. I mean, obviously China is, India is, so it's moved away from the original conception. So I'm sure it will continue, but it will probably be superseded by these other organizations.
Thank you for being here. I see your points with respect to the what Putin has been trying to do in terms of reestablishing Russian say legitimacy on the world stage, vis-a-vis or in contrast to China and America. I'm curious. There has not been a Russian economic miracle like there was in China, or like America presumably would be considered the leader of. So, to what extent is Putin, you know, just a sort of a ringleader in trying to claim things that aren't there?
So, I mean, historically, right, Russia has always been a great power through its ability to project military power. If you go back to the 19th century, when it was a member of the Concert of Powers, and the Russians, as you know, whenever they talk about what's a post-West world, let's go back and look at the 19th century Concert of Powers. So Russia has never been a great power economically, in as much as using its economic prowess to assert itself. So that, you know, that's point one. And so the, you know, the Putin administration, and probably even beginning in the Yeltsin administration, but particularly under Putin, they've made the decision not to modernize. I mean, not to do what it would take to become a great economic power, to remain a raw materials exporter, and it's fine when oil prices are high, but when they're not high, it's not so fine. And so, you know, and in the long run, you know, it's sustainable, but only at a lower level. And they've made that decision because the people who are now in power have made a lot of money off these rents. And they don't really have very much of an interest in undertaking the kind of structural reforms that would be necessary. Now, I mean, you wrote in Putinomics that, you know, Putin created an economic system that was viable and worked and not well enough, right? But wasn't going to, it wasn't something that was then going to take off and really enter the modern age. So I think in the long run, you're going to have a Russia whose economy becomes progressively less modern when you compare it to all of its neighbors. It's not only China, it's the different Asian countries. And yet, I'm always very careful because I've, you know, been involved a number of times in scenarios. I've worked in the government as well, and you know, people sit down and they look at the raw numbers and they look at the economy and they say, they can't go on like this. You know, they have a shrinking population, crumbling infrastructure, they're just dependent on oil and gas. But they do go on like this. And so I think, you know, they will continue to go on like this, but becoming, as I say, progressively or comparatively less modern compared to their neighbors. And in the longer run, that must have a cumulative effect, but probably takes much longer than we think.
I was curious if you might be able to briefly discuss Putin and Russia in general, their political, geopolitical calculations in regards to climate change.
Yes, so that's a great question. Mr. Putin himself has said there's nothing wrong if it's 2 degrees warmer, you know, we can grow more things. So the last time I read a study of this, and this is some time ago, I think and this was by Americans, when they look at Russia, they say, in fact, climate change is obviously bad for Russia in some areas, and in some areas maybe not so bad. There are climate scientists in Russia who understand the problem. Russia did sign on, earlier on to some of the climate change. Well, that was when Medvedev was president. But I think in general, the Russian government and the Kremlin doesn't take this very seriously. I mean, they've signed on to these agreements because it was, looked good internationally, and now they can say, we're still part of these agreements. It's the United States who's pulled out of these agreements. But I think probably they haven't taken it seriously enough. They're taking advantage of it, obviously, in the Arctic, where, it's opening up new sea routes. They're having problems in the Russian Far East because of melting ice and very bad conditions there. So some of it, they've experienced themselves, but as a country, this is not something that's really very much in the political discourse. It's not something that people who watch state-run television would know very much about.
When you mention the Arctic, many Americans look at the Arctic as one of the last areas where Russia and the United States are cooperating.
Right.
What scope do you see for cooperation between the two countries in the Arctic? Is there much at all?
Well, I mean, there is some scope for cooperation. I think when it comes to delineating, who owns what and who can develop natural resources where, that can be problematic. And of course, because we're not party to the Law of the Sea Convention, that makes it difficult too. We're not in a very good position to dictate this. There clearly will be clashes also in terms of the military aspects and the militarization of the Arctic. But in other areas, which have to do with ecology and indigenous peoples and things like that, apparently we are working better together.
What's interesting when you put these different spheres next to each other, the Arctic sphere, the economic sphere, the different foreign policy regions, it does come across that there are different institutions in Russia that are making decisions about these different spheres. And I guess I'd be interested to hear your sense of how decision-making in Russia has changed over the Putin era, the past 20 years. If you had to describe how Russia makes big foreign policy decisions today, how would you describe it?
Right, so first of all, we have to be very humble and say there's an awful lot we don't know. So, Putin is the single most powerful individual in Russia, but it's of course a mistake to think that he's all-powerful and he pulls the strings and he makes all the decisions. I think you can assume that on the most important foreign policy decisions now, like annexing Crimea, invading, the Donbass, that could not be done without, Syria, whatever, permission from the top. And from what you read, some of those very important decisions are made in a very small group of people. It's not always the same people on the same issues, but it's a small group of people. The foreign ministry, of course, is mainly the implementer. It's not the decision maker. We know through anecdotal evidence that there were decisions that were made that the foreign minister himself only found out about after, it happened. But on other issues of less, salience, then it's not all made at the top. Now there's a lot of debate about, election interference, the Skripal poisonings, all those things. So what you understand is that in a system like this, which is very opaque and where not everything is explicit, people understand that they have license to do certain things, or they understand that they're permitted to do something. But then they kind of take over. So I'm not going to say everyone's freelancing, but there's probably more that's done, depending on the issue, at a level that's below, Vladimir Putin and the people in the Kremlin, because there's this permissive atmosphere. And I think apparently that probably extends to some extent to some of the things that the intelligence services do.
And how then do states around Russia respond to that? If it's actually true that in some instances it's not the Kremlin's doing it, someone at a level below or a level outside, how does that shape your response to the United States or another power on Russia?
Well, I think the difficulty in the United States is, and I mean, this has been true for a long time, is who are your interlocutors? Now, in the case of the U.S. Russian relationship, because there aren't that many stakeholders, we don't have a robust economic relationship, the relations at the top are very important, right? And when it works, Obama and Medvedev, for instance, or Bush and Putin in the very beginning, Clinton and Yeltsin in the beginning, then everything's done at the top, and then it's supposed to filter down. When those relations don't work very well, there are very few other interlocutors. And I remember, certainly in the second Obama term and third Putin term, there was a feeling that there was really no one to talk to. So that if you were trying to respond to things that had happened, who were your interlocutors? And in the US, at least, we have a reasonably well-defined sort of system where certain undersecretaries or assistant secretaries, have, enough clout, if you like, or they have the responsibility of negotiating certain things. But there's the feeling that they never had counterparts in Russia that were permitted to make decisions in the way that they were. So this is a kind of roundabout way of saying it's very difficult in this system, and particularly now. What's changed under Putin is that the system is more personalized than it was before. In the Soviet times, there were more institutions, and people had counterparts, and they knew who to approach. This was true in the military and other ways. We have less of that now because there are fewer institutions, certainly in the foreign policy realm.
I'm glad you brought up the 2016 election. I know it's a question everyone wants to hear your view on, so let me ask you directly. You brought up the freelancing question. How does that play into your interpretation, if at all, of what Russia was trying to do or get out of 2016?
So I think Putin, we have to go back at least to 2011, right? Putin has announced that he's going to switch jobs with Medvedev. The urbanites, the liberal, educated urban elite in Moscow is furious. They think we have no agency in this. Putin's just telling us, well, he's coming back to the Kremlin. So, of course, they had parliamentary elections. There were rumors that they were falsified, and so you had these large demonstrations in Moscow that went on in December of 2011. And Putin was absolutely shocked. Apparently, he didn't understand. Why are these ungrateful people? Look how well they live in Moscow. Their standard of living has increased. How dare they go out and protest against me? And then, of course, he blamed the United States. He said Hillary Clinton had paid each demonstrator, whatever, to go out to the streets. And she then, of course, also had some very harsh words for him. And so from that day onwards, obviously, it was clear that the relationship, if we're talking about relationship at the top, between Vladimir Putin and Hillary Clinton was not going to be one that was very good, to put it mildly. And so you fast forward to 2016, and as we know, this began before 2016, if you read the Mueller report. There were obviously people who were sent over here 2015 to sort of, scout out the place and see what was happening. And when 2016 came, you had a candidate, Donald Trump, even though before he won all the primaries, but he was saying, I don't see why we can't get along with Russia. We can make a deal with Russia. He questioned whether Crimea, in fact, did belong to Ukraine. We know that the Republican platform, once he had won the primaries, was changed under Paul Manafort to sort of change what it said about Ukraine. So here you had a candidate who was saying he wanted a forward-looking policy toward Russia. He'd been trying to do business in Russia since 1987. He'd been trying to build a Trump Tower or some property there, as opposed to a Hillary Clinton, who had very harsh things to say about Russia. So I don't think that the Kremlin believed that Donald Trump would win. I thought they thought Hillary Clinton would win. But they understood this was a very polarized society, and they made very adept use of the social media, and the social media companies were sort of asleep at the wheel. And the U.S. government, I think, was very slow. The people who were in office then were slow to understand what was happening.
What should have been done in the U.S. government in summer or fall of 2016?
Well, I think once they figured out what was happening, they should have, done more publicly and everything to counter it. And the argument you get was that, well, they believed, the Obama administration, the people believed that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and therefore they thought they didn't have to do it. There was some internal debate about it, certainly, but they didn't. And so I think with the interference, that was clearly something where people believed, Mr. Prigozhin sitting with his people working in the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, and others believed that they had the green light to go ahead and do this. And they could do it. It was rather easy. I mean, imagine the sense of success. You're sitting in St. Petersburg and you can, you know, rouse people to go to rallies, Black Lives Matter versus white supremacists. And, you know, it's not that you created the divisions, but you're really, you know, fostering them too.
Let's take some more questions if there are some. Yeah.
Hi, so I was wondering if you could touch on a little bit on the impact of the 1990s on Russian politics today, but not simply with respect to Putin's rise, but also Putin's staying power, his popularity, which, while that is waning, based on some of the readings that I've done, I'm under the impression that many Russians do not remember the 1990s very fondly. And it seems like year after year there was a new crisis of some sort. And I've also read that many Russians, especially in the early 2000s, were describing the Yeltsin years as tainted, and the relations formed with the Clinton administration with the Americans as tainted, and the extent to which the Yeltsin administration's policies, the way in which he did politics, have discredited their broader westernizing project. So,
yeah. I think that's certainly true. So I think for Russians who were alive in the 1990s and adult enough to remember what was happening, they look upon it very much as a time of chaos and humiliation, and this is a narrative that is very much fostered by Putin and all the people around him. But there's a reality to it too, because the Soviet Union collapsed. The economy was in tatters, really. It began to recover, and then what most of the Russian people saw was that a small number of people got fabulously wealthy under these privatization schemes. There was a voucher privatization scheme where each worker in the factory was given a voucher, but the problem was, instead of getting something for it, someone else came along, bought the vouchers up for a rather small amount of money, and then that person went on to make a lot of money. So they saw a time of great economic inequality, of great unpredictability. The worst thing was in 1998 with the collapse of the ruble, when people lost all of their savings. And then they saw, you know, a leader who many of them thought was humiliating. He, you know, clearly had a problem with alcohol. He behaved in a way which made some people feel that, you know, this didn't represent the best of Russia. And then they've been also, I think, led to believe that Russia then had no agency in what it was doing in foreign policy, and it had to submit and accept an agenda that was dictated by the West. And so for people who follow foreign policy, they would look to the wars in the ex-Yugoslavia, particularly what happened in Kosovo or Serbia, where, you know, they believed that Russia was, you know, was asked to do something that was against its interest, and then you had the bombing of Serbia, you know, without consulting the Russians. Then there's also, I mean, again, for people who follow the foreign policy, they will probably talk about NATO enlargement, but those aren't the things that really matter to people. It's the pocketbook issues, and it's the sense that in the 1990s, of the impoverishment, the lack of clarity or predictability about what was going to happen, and the feeling that, you know, Russia was a humiliated country. So, as I said, Putin very much nurtures this narrative, but there is something to it too. And so they see him as someone who restored a strong state, and, you know, their lives got better, largely because oil prices went up, which he didn't actually have anything to do with. But, you know, Russia, and, you know, under Putin, and again, you write about that too, Russia has pursued, you know, a very, you know, pretty good macroeconomic, fiscal stabilization, things like that. I mean, it's done quite well with that.
So besides government media, which is often talked about, over the last few years, Russia has begun employing a number of tools to try to influence foreign publics, including organizations to support compatriots abroad, humanitarian aid, the Russian Orthodox Church, and even has created its own public diplomacy fund. The concept of soft power has started to emerge in Russia's foreign policy concept. So what role do you think the notion of soft power plays in Russia's foreign policy more broadly?
So I think the soft power towards the compatriots, towards Russian speakers, the Ruskoye Yazычniki, the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, I think that is quite well thought out, as you say. This is designed to appeal to people who identify with Russian culture, who either live in the former Soviet space or more broadly in other countries, including the United States. And it's a pretty well thought out program with the Russian world, with the Orthodox Church, and the Orthodox Church is very active, again, abroad in promoting these kind of traditional values. You know, Vladimir Putin himself puts himself forward as a politician, as a leader who supports traditional values. Russia is the leader of the Conservative International. So this kind of soft power appeals, first of all, to people who speak Russian, love the language, you know, love the culture, the music and everything, and maybe the religion, but also to other groups around the world who would identify themselves as being more traditional, you know, people with traditional values. And, you know, Putin himself has said that, you know, Western Christianity has become satanic. It's not true Christianity anymore. The Russian Orthodox Church is the harbinger of what Christianity is supposed to be. So appealing to those kind of conservative groups, socially conservative groups, with Russian soft power, and then also, I would say, to a variety of, I'm talking about Europe now, and to some extent the United States, kind of extreme right-wing and left-wing groups, you know, who either don't like the European Union or don't like the United States or both. So, and you know, even in this country, you have some people, some Trump supporters who look quite favorably upon Russia, and people who watch RT and think that RT gives them better news than CNN does. But so the focus of Russian soft power is clearly with the compatriots, but I think it extends somewhat beyond that too.
What's your perspective on Putin's relationships with the ethnic minorities, particularly in the South? Chechnya is no longer kind of in the headlines anymore, but is that a danger to Putin's regime in the longer term? What's your perspective on that?
Putin has been very careful to appeal as someone who's ethnically inclusive. I think it was quite ironic when Steve Bannon was in the White House, he tweeted out once, you know, we love Vladimir Putin because, you know, he's the leader of white people against the Muslims. That's exactly not what Putin is. So Putin, you know, he understands the issues with Russia's South. I mean, what's happened in Chechnya clearly is, you know, he's back now for a long time Ramzan Kadyrov, a very authoritarian, thuggish leader who rules that part of the world. And he leaves him alone as long as, you know, there's no fighting there, as long as Chechnya is quiet. Whatever Ramzan Kadyrov does, he does. Under Putin, Russia is an observer at the Organization of Islamic Conferences organization, so he is very careful in what he says and does to have an inclusive policy toward ethnic minorities. Now, what happened? Now, obviously, that doesn't suffice. He's also aware that, you know, a few thousand people from Russia went to fight for the Islamic State. Some of them from the North Caucasus, but also Central Asian migrants who live in Russia and tend to become radicalized when they live in Russia because of the conditions there. And I think that's one of the reasons also why Russia got into Syria. So far, it's working, but if you talk to Russians who really understand the situation, they will say, if you go to the North Caucasus in general, those 6 republics, the laws of the Russian Federation don't really apply there. I mean, they're living outside of the laws of the Russian Federation, and again, as long as they're quiet, and there isn't too much, I mean, there are low-level insurgencies, but as long as this doesn't present a major problem, then he leaves them alone. So in the long run, it's very interesting. So the Russian birth rate is declining, but there's one part of Russia where the birth rate isn't declining, it's still very robust, and that's in the North Caucasus. So the ethnic mix in Russia is going to change over the next decades, and the population will become relatively more Muslim than it is now. And that also will probably change what a future leader has to deal with, but not for Putin.
Thank you. So I was wondering, why does the West and the U.S. still see Russia as a threat? Because obviously it doesn't have the potential to be a threat, as it seems to me. Why? What's the reason?
Well, I mean, it may be, you know, its economy may be not modern, but first of all, it is pretty good and sophisticated at cyber operations. That's one issue. I mean, we know that, and we can read in our newspapers that, you know, at one point our electricity grid was penetrated, that the Russians were interfering up till the day of the midterm elections last November, and our own cyber command had to intervene and make sure that didn't happen. So, you know, Russians are very good at those kinds of things. And then, you know, they are able to project military power and make it difficult or challenge Western interests, you know, as they are doing in Ukraine and as they're potentially doing in other parts of the world. So, yeah, Russia is listed, you know, if you read our national security strategy, it's listed with China as the two top sort of challenges to the United States because it has the ability to disrupt, because it has these cyber powers, and it can project its power militarily in areas where we also have interests.
Do you see any long-term particular strategy or vision within these both external and internal affairs, or does it look rather as a chain of reactions on certain events?
Long-term strategy on Putin's part?
Yeah, on Putin's part.
Yeah, not really. I think I mean, as I said, I think he's able to take advantage of opportunities presented to him. I don't see him as a strategist particularly. So when people ask about grand strategy in Russia, I'm not so sure about that. You know, it's to make sure that Russia has a seat at the table on all important issues. It's to make sure that, you know, Euro-Atlantic institutions don't move any closer to Russia, that Russia has a sphere of influence, and things like that. But beyond that, beyond wanting to have the rest of the world treat Russia as if it were the Soviet Union, a great power to be feared, to be respected, I don't know what the long-term strategy is. I don't think it is one.
I'm coming from Slovenia. Can you focus on former Yugoslavia? What is going on with competition between USA and Russia? We now know that with Montenegro and North Macedonia, the Euro-Atlantic agenda is winning. But what will happen to Kosovo, and then finally, maybe most important, with Bosnia?
With Bosnia, right. So exactly, that's an area now where we see Russia coming back in a way that it wasn't as active before. As you mentioned in Bosnia, I mean, that was always a very fragile state, but it's now even more so. And the Russian backing of the Republika Srpska and everything that's going on there, you could see that actually possibly falling apart. We don't know how long that will last. We know what happened in Montenegro. There was a failed attempt at a coup there to prevent Montenegro from joining NATO. We know what happened in the referendum in North Macedonia, and of course Serbia. I mean, Russia's investing quite a lot, both, you know, financially but politically also in Serbia. I think it understands that, you know, so far Serbia would like to join the European Union. I mean, let's see whether that happens, but clearly it doesn't look as if, you know, the current Serb leadership or going forward is going to want to join NATO. And there's a lot of Russian money, right, in the Western Balkans, even in a country like Montenegro that is now a member of NATO. So I think things have changed, because I think in the earlier years, I mean, first of all, you had the interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo, the NATO interventions, and Russian kind of reluctance there. And then all was sort of quiet. And the belief was that, you know, Russia was focused on other countries in Europe, and if a country in the Western Balkans wanted to join NATO, well, you know, that wasn't such a big deal. And I think that's changed now, and I think that, you know, Putin also maybe sees an opportunity there. And so, you know, we see Russia, you know, putting more money and also just time into these Balkan, and again, trying to benefit from these tensions that exist already there, particularly between the different ethnic groups.
You mentioned the Russian money that's present in the Balkans. We also hear a lot about Russian money in Western financial markets, above all perhaps in London, a city that you know very well. I guess there was a thesis in the 90s and 2000s, even in the Obama era, that if you have economic ties, you'll have better political ties come out of that. But it seems to have not been the case. I'm interested to hear you explain why not.
Right, and that's again a question that I look at in the book. Why we believed, and political scientists believe, right, that if you know, improved economic ties somehow spills over into the political realm, that integrating Russia into the global economy would also enable better cooperation between Russia and the West and other countries. And of course, you know, the Germans particularly believed in that. So Germany, you know, has had a different attitude clearly towards relations with Russia for both historical and geographic reasons, believing that it has to have a partnership with Russia, it has to engage Russia. Russia may be a difficult neighbor, but it's a neighbor and you have to deal with it. And I think the Germans also felt, and I think I have to phrase in there, that the United States had a far too short a time horizon in the 1990s for expecting change to happen in Russia. And the Germans said this is going to take decades, 5, 6, 7 decades, you know, based partly on their own experience, but you can't expect things to change that quickly. And so they concertedly led the European Union. They developed this partnership for modernization a number of years ago when Mr. Steinmeier was the foreign minister. He's now the president, in the belief that if we partner with the Russians, if we encourage economic modernization, this will also lead to improved political ties. Well, the Germans will now say the result of that is a partnership without modernization. In other words, even the kind of economic modernization they were hoping to foster through this EU partnership didn't happen. Of course, you know, then with the Crimean annexation, this came to an end. But I think Russia is a case where the Russian government has always tried to separate the economic and political aspects of its ties with foreign countries. And even though obviously some of this on the Russian side is carried out by private companies, what we've seen under Putin, and particularly since 2014, is an increasing, you know, renationalization of the economy. So there are fewer private, totally private foreign economic actors. I mean, there's still some, obviously. But even those have to watch what they do. And somehow we haven't seen, you know, this impact, I think because, you know, the Russian state or the Russian actors who deal with this have tried to prevent it.
How do you see the post-Putin world unfolding? You've been down there for 20 years, but how do you see it?
So you're assuming there's a post-Putin world. Yeah, so I think it depends how it comes about. So one scenario is, you know, Putin's term expires in 2024, and there's some kind of a managed succession. We know that he's appointed a number of younger governors, provincial governors. Maybe he's trying out some of these men who are in their 40s. I mean, there's no apparent successor now, right? There are just lots of rumors. But let's say he tries to do more or less what Boris Yeltsin did in 1999, choose a successor, and then it's managed. And a wrinkle on that now is a lot of people think he's looking at what's happening in Kazakhstan, and he's maybe thinking of doing what Mr. Nazarbayev has done, which is say, well, I'm not going to be president anymore, but I'm going to be the head of the state council or something else, and so the person who's the president in the Kremlin will be there, but they won't have full autonomy. You know, another rumor is that he'll create this Russian Belarus state, and he'll become the president of that, and someone else will be the president of Russia. I personally don't really believe in that, but, you know, some people do, and I read some of what the Russians are writing. So let's say there's a marriage transition and somebody comes in. So a condition of coming in to take over is that the elite around Putin will be protected, just as when Yeltsin handed over to Putin, Putin promised Mr. Yeltsin and his family that there would be no prosecutions against them, and he kept his word. He did not keep his word in terms of all of the other oligarchs. He met with them, you know, and said, stay out of politics. Some of them didn't, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and of course he landed up in jail for 10 years, and then some of the other ones who owned TV stations had to flee. All right. So the question now is you then have to make a deal where you agree to protect the interests of not only of the Putin family, but of people around Putin. And that's a little bit more complicated because we're talking about more people now. So that's a way of saying you could have someone who comes in a managed transition, and in the beginning it looks very similar, but then maybe things would start to change. You could actually have more internal squabbling if not all the interests of these other people are protected. I don't see any change immediately, either domestically or in foreign policy. Now, you could get more domestic change further down the road if the person who comes in either decides that they really do want something that's a little bit different. You know, can you have, it's a Putin system, but as I said, it's highly personalized, and therefore if it's a different person atop this pyramid, it could in the end change, or they might in the end build more institutions. So I wouldn't expect change immediately. But I could also see a situation where you could get some domestic change, but not necessarily that the foreign policy would change, that you're suddenly going to have someone come in and say, now it's time really to have much better relations with the West. It's hard to see that happening in the medium term, although in the longer term, nobody knows. Now, if Mr. Putin, as some people in Russia believe, doesn't do a managed transition, and he stays there until the bitter end, and you have more squabbling after that, or more internal struggle for power, that could also lead to, I mean, if you look at Soviet Russian history, a more aggressive foreign policy. It doesn't have to, but it could. But that's really very much speculation. So the shorter answer to that is we really don't know.
Thank you.
Russia's been an active participant in a war in Ukraine that's gone on for over 5 years and killed over 10,000 people and displaced over 1.2 million people, but has yet to formally acknowledge that it has any role in this conflict. How has Putin not suffered more domestic pushback from a conflict that's gone on this long, that has resulted in many Russian casualties, that they can't openly acknowledge? And are there any, do you foresee a scenario where Putin may look to save face and quietly disengage from this war?
So, you know, the annexation of Crimea still remains very popular, right? That was relatively bloodless, didn't cost very much money, although it actually is costing the Russian state more money. But so if you watch Russian television, official Russian television, what you would know about what's going on in Ukraine is Crimea is ours, it's great, they're very happy to be with Russia. And then there's separatists fighting in Ukraine, but it's a civil war. That's the official Russian narrative, is it's a civil war between, you know, Ukrainian fascists, right? Anyone who's not a separatist, and separatists who want something different. Of course, Russians know when their loved ones come home and they're dead. They know when their sons come home and they've been killed. And there is clearly, there's a kind of an underground resentment and concern about this, because they know what's happening. But none of this percolates really up to the top. The public opinion data now shows, however, that the war or the situation in Ukraine is less popular than it was before. And as you get this questioning now about the pension reform and people's standard of living not being so good, there are people who are beginning to say, what is this war in Ukraine costing us? Although the number of Russian casualties, they don't know what they are, and it hasn't been a huge amount. And then, of course, you have, as you say, 1.2 million refugees and displaced people, but some of these are in Russia, and of course are fueling the narrative that they fled there because of the way they were treated by the people in Kiev. It's hard to see a face-saving way for Putin to end this. What Russia is insisting on in these Minsk protocols is special status for the Donbass that would give that region inordinate say in decisions that the Ukrainian government can make about foreign policy. The Ukrainian government has, the previous government at least, introduced legislation that would decentralizing legislation but would apply uniformly to Ukraine, and that hasn't really gone through. And the Russians say, we're still at a stalemate where the Russians say we're not going to withdraw or do anything until the Ukrainians, first of all, fulfill their side of the agreement. So there's complete stalemate in that. So short of some deal being made between the West and Russia, saying, all right, Crimea is part of Russia if you get out of southeastern Ukraine, and I'm not even sure that that would work with the Russians. Short of that, that's, I think, not something you're going to see from the West anytime soon. I don't see a face-saving way for Putin to get out of Ukraine, particularly since it's not officially acknowledged that Russian troops are there.
Well, I know that this talk has been primarily about Russia, but I'd love to ask a bit about the United States, which has had a very interesting Russian policy the past 2.5 years.
Does it have a Russian policy?
Well, that's my question, I guess. And I know that you're someone who has a very clear sense of the debate in Washington as it plays out. So I'd love to hear your sense of how the United States has interacted with Russia since Trump became president, the different schools of thought from the administration, and what might come next.
Right. So, you know, on the one hand, you have a president in the White House who still wants a forward-leaning relationship with Russia. He said so. He still says, why can't we get along with Russia? You know, again, has never criticized Putin. Putin hasn't criticized him. In fact, Putin has said the American people are not letting Mr. Trump do his job because of all these investigations. And of course, Putin has now said, and he said it, you know, 2 days ago, from a mountain came a mouse on the Mueller report. And he, of course, has said that the Mueller report proves that there was no Russian interference, which of course is not true. It has certainly proved that there was Russian interference. So you have this president that wants a forward-looking policy, but the problem is he's completely hamstrung by these Russia investigations. So, on the other hand, you have an executive branch that has pursued a pretty tough policy toward Russia. What is that policy? Well, it's a sanctions policy. We have sanctions and more sanctions and more sanctions. And now you have a national security advisor who doesn't believe in arms control agreements, and so we've pulled out of one arms control agreement, and we may, you know, we may not extend a new START agreement, which would leave us in a pretty dangerous world. So those are the elements that I see of a sort of a Russia policy, which is sanctions and sort of skepticism about arms control. The U.S. Congress has been even tougher than anyone else because they're the ones that have taken away the power of the president to lift sanctions. Obama had that because the sanctions were imposed by executive order, and they're all congressionally enshrined, and you and I know it took 25 years for the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to be removed, long after Gorbachev liberalized Jewish immigration, but once this legislation is on the books, and it was only removed when they then passed the Magnitsky Act, which is obviously restricts and puts visa bans on certain Russians. The problem I see with all of this is these kind of sanctions have no quid pro quo. The Ukrainian sanctions at least did, right? They were imposed by the EU and by the United States, but the idea is if Russia came some way towards fulfilling the Minsk agreements, making some concessions, then some of these sanctions would be lifted. There's nothing like that in CATSA or the new ones, Deter, DASCA, all of these new bills. There's no quid pro quo. It's just punishment, punishment, punishment. So it's a kind of a strange way of going about the policy. And I would say, I don't think that it's clear what this administration wants in terms of its relationship with Russia. What is it that we're looking for? Obviously, we'd like them to stop interfering in our elections. But beyond that, and get out of the Donbass, but beyond that, it's not clear what the policy is. And, you know, I think it's a shame in a way that Russia has become such a toxic subject domestically, because for some people who oppose President Trump, the words Trump and Russia are synonymous. And I'm sure, you know, you hear a lot about that when you go to Russia too. It would be better if it wasn't all sort of entangled with each other, so it makes it very difficult to have a sensible and a non-polarized discussion about Russia, at least publicly.
Well, I guess that's a good note on which to wrap after an hour and a half of sensible and non-polarized discussion on Russia. So thank you very much for joining us, Angela. Congratulations.